Great.
Welcome, everyone. We'll just let everybody pile in. We'll get going in a sec. This is a webinar / discussion, Models for Collaboration, GLAM and ML AI Technologies on behalf of the Australia New Zealand chapter of AI for LAM. So you are in the right place. Great. We'll get going. Kia koutou ngā munga, ngā awa, ngā waka, ngā tupuna o Aotearoa me te whenua moemoea e hui mai nei, tēnā koutou katoa. To you, the mountains, rivers, waka, ancestors of Aotearoa and the land of the dreaming that are gathered here, and those of you further afield, greetings to you all. My name is Rowan Payne. I'm one of the co-conveners of the Australia New Zealand chapter of AI for LAM. Very happy to have you all here today. I am coming to you from the National Library of New Zealand, the digital experience team. My team runs Digital New Zealand, Aotearoa. I will hand over to my colleague Ingrid Mason for an Australian acknowledgement. Thank you.
Kia ora, Rowan. It's lovely to have everyone here with us today for this webinar. So my name is Ingrid Mason. I work at the National Film and Sound Archive and I head up the Program Management Office. We are running a big investment program called the Audiovisual Australia Program. And I come to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And I would like to acknowledge traditional owners past and present and their leaders, and also other communities associated with the Canberra and the ACT area, and that's Ngadago and the Ngambri people. I would like to encourage those of you who would like to tell us where you're coming from today. So we have had people registering from all over Australia, and some people across the Tasman and New Zealand as well, but also around the globe. Lovely, we've got someone from Wajak country. Welcome, Louise. Anyone else? Gabi Gabi, fantastic. It's a great way of practicing other languages. Kana country, oh, thank you, Sarah, that's lovely. Mina Mani. So today we have two great speakers to talk to us about models of collaboration. But before we kick that off, I would just like to say, yes, we are running this webinar as part of the regional chapter for artificial intelligence for libraries, archives and museums. And this year, we're hosting the international conference here in Canberra, on Ngunnawal country at the National Film and Sound Archive. And we will be hopefully getting the call for papers out pretty soon on that front. We invite you to put in questions or comments into the chat as the speakers progress through this conversation together. And pop questions in. We've got the lovely Ashlyn Harty helping us with magic hands behind the scene to help make sure that we can try and feed in some of your ideas into the conversation. So I'm going to introduce you to our great speakers today. Dr. Mia Ridge, she's from the British Library. She's the library's digital curator for Western Heritage Collections. She is part of the digital research team, providing advice and training on computational research, AI, machine learning, and crowdsourcing. She's a co-investor on the Living with Machines grant. She's co-curated the Living with Machines exhibition with Leeds Museums and Galleries. Welcome, Mia. It's great to have you with us today. And it's particularly lovely that you're in our time zone. And I would also like to introduce Sarah Germaine. She is the Deputy CEO and the Manager of Member and Academic Services for CAVAL. And she has over 15 years experience working with a diverse range of fields and organisations, including IBM and Federation University Australia. She's an advocate for all things open and open source. She's a tech evangelist, and she's hoping to show ways that people can leverage open standards to lead to innovation and change. So welcome to the both of you. And I wonder if I might kick this conversation off with a big meaty question to sort of bump us into this discussion about models for collaboration and AI. And that big meaty question is, could you describe the models of collaboration that you currently work with that enable you to progress knowledge of and ability to explore and utilize AI or ML technologies? There is another question. What other models do you think are or not well suited to the work undertaken by GLAMs? And Mia, if I understand, you have some slides you'd like to share, so maybe we can kick off with you.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid, and hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I prepared some slides just to kind of structure my thinking and also just give you a kind of multi-channel way of thinking about things. So just reflecting on some of the collaborations that methods or structures that I've been involved with in the past. One really important one to mention or acknowledge is the solo developer. It could be a passion project, someone developing software for their own research, for their own academic or community research or interests. It could be a solo developer in an institution who's trying to support the entire needs of an institution. For each of these, I've kind of gone through some of the pros and the cons. And solo developers can really, really move fast. They can build exactly the thing that they need. And sometimes other people might need exactly that same thing again. It does ideally need developers who understand and value user experience and user needs. So often you might see in open source projects a couple of really key maintainers, but they're less responsive to user needs. So that can really affect how the uptake of things. And there's also limited capacity. There's no money for the kinds of extras, services that you might procure for different things. And there's also notoriously, we need a nicer name for this, but the hit by a bus risk. If someone goes, what happens to their outputs, and also the risk that they might get burnt out and not want to maintain something anymore. But solo developers can do an incredible amount. And I also wanted to think about models for services that build systems for communities. This is a screenshot from VicNet in the 90s, about 1995, 96. No, sorry, it's about 1999, which is when I worked there. And my experience was working as a developer in a kind of centralized pool. We could apply our expertise to local needs. So we'd build sites for nonprofits and community organizations, as well as things like the Comedy Festival and others. One of the benefits of that was that organizations would get training to maintain their own content. So there's a level of upskilling, but not necessarily the upskilling required to maintain software over time. Because the thing about digital projects is they atrophy as soon as they're launched. They just start to decay because dependencies and conventions change. And the modern equivalent, I think, might be things like the research software engineer and other services offered by King's Digital Labs in the UK and probably others around the world, where you don't need to maintain your own in-house team, but you can procure their services at relatively more affordable costs. But these organizations also need to pay competitive wages. So it's not a cheap option, it's just a bit more affordable. And again, if you're outsourcing, you're not getting as many skills in-house, but it might be the best option in many cases. Spent a lot of time at the British Library working on in-house pilots, and some of them have gone through to production, but aren't quite like library scale. That's partly because the library's collections are really big. Even the smaller sort of sub-collections are still quite big. But the great thing about in-house pilots is it's minimal investment. It's mostly staff time, maybe a bit of server. You can learn a lot quite quickly. You can create proofs of concept that really help to answer questions in the organization about, is this possible? And you can actually just build things that solve local problems, small scale problems, building things for yourself. It does require time or skills in your staff. And scaling up work to work across entire collections. So going from proof of concept to operationalization requires a lot more resources, a lot more cooperation, a lot more coordination, and probably a lot more compromise as well. And I think compromise is one of the themes in my thinking about infrastructure and collaboration. It's really hard to get exactly the thing that you need 100% for your organization if you're collaborating, because there's always ways that you have to compromise and find mutually agreeable outcomes. And then finally, integrating the results of this kind of enrichment into core systems can be hard. And I found that's the case whether it's an AI or machine learning kind of experiment, or a crowdsourcing experiment, or any other kind of collaboration that might also look at things like round-tripping data onto Wikidata or Wikimedia Commons, or Flickr Commons. It's not necessarily easy to pull in data sources into central systems that have come from these sort of smaller scale experiments. And then large scale partnerships. I worked on a project called Living with Machines for 5 or 6 years. Created lots of different things. We learned a lot. We had a huge team, relatively 24 people or so generally. So we could experiment and learn a lot concurrently. And because we had a lot of people on the team from a lot of different disciplines, that led to bigger impacts because everyone produced outputs relevant to their field and talked about it in their field. So we've that made a big difference that way. We didn't only reach library people or GLAM people, but we can also create tools that can be used across the sector. So we've got a lot of open source code, variously packaged in terms of how complete the documentation and other information is, but what's public should be quite usable and might help someone else scratch that itch. But these large scale partnerships, there's a huge collaboration overhead, even just the meetings to coordinate work, but also the emotional labor in understanding each other's definitions of success. Data scientists move at the speed of 3-month sort of sprints, and they can publish a data paper at the end of that. The historians in the project are working on the final book until 2025. So matching timelines and definitions of success and ways of working can be hard. And I mentioned that you've got to compromise to find something, the sweet spot in the middle where your goals and your methods actually meet. And for libraries and GLAMs, that might mean that you get things that aren't particularly suited for your infrastructure or for converting into ways of providing access for your readers. So there's still work to be done to integrate the results. And I spent the last year of the Living with Machines project, the day after I launched the exhibition, I started legacy planning for the last year of the project to make sure that all the data was documented, rights were documented, licenses were documented, everything sort of like in our research repository as much as we can, or somewhere in our systems. So it might not give you that immediate ability to work with your collections data, and you also need the ability to kind of contribute collections data to these systems. And that's the same for a lot of thinking about collaboration via infrastructure. So that might be Trove, that might be Papers Pass, that might be Europeana. It could be any of these kind of shared systems, particularly national systems, but also regional systems or format specific systems. One really sort of low cost way is to publish open content on Flickr Commons, Wikimedia Commons as open data sets and Zenodo research repositories. People can use them without a formal partnership. So you're reducing that collaboration overhead, but the trade-off is that you don't necessarily know how people are using your content. So you don't know, are there usability improvements that you could do to make it easier to access, like change the size of your data sets, improve your documentation, provide code examples. And you don't necessarily get those stories about impact, which you can then use to do more work because you can show the difference that it's made. And then the other end of the scale is collaborating on shared platforms for common use. So you can reduce the overhead of everyone managing their own technical teams, technical work, share development costs, share expertise. You can probably meet the majority of your needs, and it's certainly better than nothing. It won't meet all your needs because every GLAM is a special butterfly when it comes to their collections, and everyone wants to keep the special butterfly bit, and maybe at the cost of focusing more on collaborating. And it does, like all of these systems, require some kind of innovative financial model to make sure that the infrastructure that you've built together lasts outside the project. So it's one thing to build things, it's another thing entirely to sustain and maintain systems. And particularly for collaborations that are based around research, soft money often goes towards building systems, and there's less consideration for how will you make sure that system still exists in 5 or 10 years' time. So those are some of the collaborations that I've worked on, and I just thought it might be useful to kind of set out those different models and their pros and cons.
That's brilliant. I've been taking notes, which is why I've been leaning away from the camera. Thank you, Mia. Wow, that's a really great set of different contexts for collaboration. Hearing very clearly what plays out in those different contexts and the different sets of contributions and expectations that kind of go into and come out of. Thank you. That was really top notch, and a really nice comment there from Tuhi in the chat on that front. Sarah, I'm going to ask you now to kind of, I guess, talk to that question, given that you work in a very specific context in this regard.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I think it's also to tie in with what Mia was talking about collaboration, but I'm not sure if everyone knows, but the C in CAVAL is actually about cooperative and being a cooperative in Victoria. And just on that word alone, CAVAL's got quite a clear mission in mind of, you know, fostering and facilitating and encouraging collaboration, not just within our membership, but within sectors and organizations that may want to partner with us. And CAVAL, you know, comes together from a human perspective and try and work out what our needs are rather than trying to replicate the wheel across our 8 institutions. And if our 8 institutions have got the same problem, then obviously the broader community have got that problem as well. And I think some of the challenges that we've had in the past is obviously there's competing strategic priorities. There's obviously what's sexy at the time. And, you know, we don't necessarily want to think about what happens in 10, 15 years time with our data or, you know, what we're preserving. So we look at trying to find a middle ground across our membership to go, you know, we've all got differing funding and resourcing capabilities. We've all got our different strategic priorities. How can we create a level playing field across everyone and deliver something that is collaborative, meets most of our needs, rather than, like I said, trying to have reinvent that wheel. And given that it's within the heart of everything that we do with collaboration, we sort of tie and create those connections with different organizations like CAVAL and JISC in the UK, because, you know, they're already doing some amazing things. Why should we have to, you know, recreate things? Can we just partner with an organization overseas and bring that service to Australia rather than, you know, trying to create something in our own piece of the world? We also partner with the likes of ALIA and IATSIS and NASLA to see what their problems are and what our problems are, and see if we can actually work on it together rather than trying to, like I said, reinvent the wheel. But that's really just a bit of a nutshell. But I think with AI and ML, we're all trying to tackle that exact same problem. And the meetings that we're having just with our interest groups and our members, they're all swapping ideas and swapping understanding so that they don't have to try and create new bits of documentation. I think even in mentioning open source and open values, if we can open that up, then, you know, we can make use of our resources better and make use of our funding better as well.
So to that point, this is a very interesting time for all of us working in the collecting sector, where these new technologies have kind of dropped into our world. And you made a point there, Sarah, about what's sexy versus what's needed. And I think that's a very interesting one to discuss, because collaboration often does come around solving problems. And I'm just wondering, are there areas of AI, understanding around AI, where you can identify that actually having those information exchanges have actually helped people sort of start to begin to understand what the response is from that group of parties that are actually interested in how to exploit these technologies?
I think, interestingly, it's the fear of the unknown and the constant change in AI that everyone's sort of coming forth and going, I don't know where to start, I don't know what to do. And if we've all got that shared sort of feeling, then we can all take that dip into the rabbit hole quite in a safer environment, right, rather than trying to individually do it. But I think the benefits that our sector has is that we understand data structures, we understand the change in technology, and we do adapt quite well. So can we actually harness that understanding and wanting of that knowledge and use that and spread it widely?
So Mia, I'm just wondering, because you've had quite a bit of experience with those different approaches to collaborations or contexts, I'm just wondering what you've learned about collaboration models in those different contexts. And you've talked about different sets of expectations. So Sarah, you've talked about the collecting community having something very strongly in common. We all eat data for breakfast. And what happens when you have partners that have very different skill sets and also expectations? I'm just wondering if that's actually a useful kind of counterpoint here when you're collaborating with people who are very like you versus collaborating with people who are not like you, but you see opportunity together.
Yeah, it's kind of made me reflect on like other models of collaboration that I didn't pull out. And one is the UK government is doing a lot of work around AI ethics and responsible AI. So I've been reaching out to people in the British Library isn't a government department, we're an arm's length body, but we are sort of civil servants, so some of it applies, to see what they're thinking and to try and capture some of the most relevant models for what we're doing. But there's also a kind of realized a rumor mill. So people, one of the things I'm doing at the library is working on an ethical guide for AI as part of a small working group working on the AI strategy for the library. So we're getting people reaching out to us saying, we've heard that you're doing this, can we align things? So now we're probably collaborating a bit more with some of the other national libraries in the UK, and maybe also with some sort of international groups as well, because there's so much happening in the field. There's so much reading to try and keep up with things. There's like 600, I think, ethical guides to AI that UNESCO have catalogued. So there's no point everyone trying to do the same thing in parallel. It's much better if we can like collaborate and share out some of the work. So there's a kind of like whisper network as well that comes into play, but also talks like this in terms of like people realizing who's doing work already and who they can go and talk to. Because I think we've sort of lost some of that collaborative, the lightweight, light scale, light touch collaborations post-COVID, because there's fewer queues for coffee at events and places where you can just get talking to someone and kind of naturally find ways to work together. But I think libraries are a special kind of context. GLAMs are a special kind of context. Teaching AI literacy in a library is fantastic because people are so data literate. But the challenge that we have at the moment is thinking about encouraging the whole organization to think about what AI might mean, how they might responsibly procure or build AI systems. So people like marketing and security and HR who don't necessarily have the same sense of library values and the same sense of data that people who work with collections or reference services or with readers have. So there's a like lifting the literacy of the whole organization through conversations and giving people space to talk about how they'll localize things to their context. So marketing people think really differently about sharing data than librarians do. And they work in a library, so we need to find space for those conversations.
I think that's, wow, this is very interesting about where you have established relationships. And so CAVAL, Sarah, is a really good example of that, and the sort of experience that you've had with the division of labour around areas where you actually have the same problem, but also I'm imagining you and many of your member organisations are tackling this AI literacy challenge right now. Is there anything you'd like to share on that front?
I think the biggest thing is that it's tacked on top of the work that we're already doing, right? So it's not even just about having specific people focusing and becoming subject matter experts to be able to share that and train the trainer and all of that sort of thing. I think it's become just an added piece of work, and it has become quite difficult to be able to keep up to date and be able to implement something that is usable and not just, you know, just playing around with ChatGPT, which is what most people are doing. They're not actually looking at ways that they can implement it because they don't have dedicated resources or time to be able to do that. So I know of a lot of open education resources that are being developed at the moment about AI literacy and ethics and all of that sort of thing, but not necessarily specific active projects to implement something because they're not sure how it looks at the moment.
That's interesting though, because there is a muscle there that's already been kind of developed and exercised in university libraries around literacy. So this is kind of, as you say, it's come in on top, and but there is an established practice of kind of sharing information and doing that kind of work. And I think there's a nice contrast there, Mia, with where you have to really work even within an organisation across areas. And I'm just wondering whether either of you think that an important starting point for collaboration is trying to get that baseline, that everybody's on the same page? Do you think that that's a really critical step to kind of start that collaboration, whether it's an existing one or actually one that you're trying to build?
I think it's like a classic UX answer. It depends. It depends on how much you're investing. It depends on like the opportunity cost of, if you're doing that, then what aren't you doing? But I think even just conversations where you talk about your mutual needs, and I think the work that you might need to do internally to actually articulate your needs and articulate your boundaries. So there's a lot of, like Sarah said, there's a lot of like sexy, shiny stuff that you could be doing, you could be playing around with, but it's not necessarily actually going to deliver much benefit, or it might look like it's going to deliver benefit, but it's so biased or needs the quality control concerns. Basically, you might as well start from scratch. Yeah, so it really depends what you're trying to get out of a collaboration. And if it's just asking around to see, you know, what kinds of work are you doing with generative AI ethics in your organization, that's different than saying, let's all share millions of records and develop computer vision methods to look for these particular kinds of things.
So as you say, it's kind of, there's the chicken and the egg there. I'm sure you've been on this loop, both of you, around what do we want to do together and why, and the requirements process really is about trying to look at where those commonalities are. I'm going to put in the second set of questions here, which I think you've already myth busted or starting to myth bust about the value proposition of doing sexy things, which is pretty low, but it can be a good kind of icebreaker, I suspect. But that there are hidden costs. And I think you touched on this a little, Mia, with the different contexts for collaboration that you looked at, about how you kind of bring people together. And that sounds a lot like a hidden cost to the collaboration, but also how you all get a much more broad set of outputs or outcomes from it. So I'm just wondering if you would like to comment on that front, where if you had your time again, you would pay more attention to something that took maybe a bit more time or a bit more effort.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to generalize from Living with Machines because it was such a unique project setup. There was a real desire to invest in what at the time was called data science and then became AI. So we didn't necessarily start from a research question or problem that we wanted to solve. We started from a really broad area and a desire to, from the library's perspective, to understand more about what the coming of AI was going to mean for access to our collections, for the kinds of demands that we would have from readers. So partly as a result of that, I've been thinking a lot about, and also thinking about how we throw things over the fence back into the library world, thinking a lot about swappable infrastructure. We tend to kind of make these big projects. We say what the infrastructure we're going to build is, but things change so fast in this world that you need to be able to swap a new language model in and out, or you need to be able to swap a new method in and out. So the days of like holding tightly to infrastructure because you've previously invested in it, that doesn't really suit the moment that we're in. So you might swap Whisper AI for something else that suddenly you found in talking to people, particularly through things like the AI for LAM community, have worked better or work better in your context. And thinking about how you can maximize the learning for minimal work at every given point, I think is really important, because things move so fast that if you're going to try things, you need to learn fast but abstract out the lessons that you're learning. So things like quality control, which is a huge issue for GLAM's thinking about AI. How do you build in human review? How do you build in the ability for people to contest any decisions that are made? Where is something a consequential decision and where does it not matter so much? Like, where is any data better than no data, and where are you making a decision that changes someone's life? So some of those lessons carry forward across any kinds of projects. So thinking about how you share those internally as well. And again, that goes back to AI literacy in your organization or in your community.
There's a great question in the chat there for both of you. So Sarah, I'm going to read it out for you to have a bit of a think out. It's come from Sam Still at the University of Queensland. Thank you, Sam. Mia mentioned early on in the transition from pilot to operations and how challenging this can be. And Mia, you've just talked about how needing to move to be very fleet-footed in this process and have people understand that. And she's asking, from your experiences, are there ways to work at the pilot stage that mean that later transition is more likely to be successful? So Sarah, I'm just wondering if you want to comment on that front, given what you're doing there at CAVAL.
Interestingly, I think it's about the skills and bringing the skills back in-house. We've seen a trend in the last 5 years where we're either pushing things back onto vendors, so we're losing our system skills, but we're also pushing things to the IT department, or the IT have taken ownership of it because they feel as though it's IT, it needs to be ours. And it means that we lose some critical skills to be able to do that quick pivoting and that quick learning, and being able to learn our systems properly so that we understand how to manage it and how to make it successful going forward. And I think if we can take some of that ownership back into the library, to our GLAM sector space, then I think we'll understand it better and be able to ask the right questions as well. We're jumping into projects without actually knowing what the systems implications are because IT are just managing that off to the side. And that's not, that's a bit scary for me because, they're managing a system that they don't necessarily understand. It's just yet another system for them.
Well, this is very interesting. I won't offer an opinion from what's happening inside here at the NFSA, but I imagine, Mia, this really speaks to, I guess, that shift that I think is there behind your discussion of models of collaboration about how quickly the organisation can move. Yeah.
And I just wanted to absolutely applaud what Sarah said. It's so, so true. I think learning is often, apart from bits of enriched metadata, at the moment, learning is the most valuable part of the work that we're doing. So don't give it away for free. Like, find ways to bring that in-house. And I think a challenge for people who work in technology departments is that we are all technologists now, one way or another. So we have to find ways of that working. Otherwise, you get shadow IT or shadow AI or whatever. And that thinking is just divisive and not helpful. One of the things that we did on Living with Machines was have some stuff based at the British Library. And a goal right from the start was to have outputs embedded into our digital scholarship training program. And I started realizing how much our digital scholarship training program is a secret sauce for us as an organization, being quite forward thinking in terms of AI and machine learning and any other technology that has to do with enhancing access to our collections and enhancing reader experiences. It's been running for 11 to 12 years now, has a range of different formats, from hands-on hack and yak sessions, which are really informal, formal training courses, reading groups, discussion sessions, and talks from people using these methods with our collections. So that has been, it means that people in the organization have a broad awareness of what's possible, what's not great, what's fantastic. But having some of the Living with Machines team based at the library meant they could really easily contribute sessions to the training program. And also they were in the library, so other library staff could come and talk to them. So FlySwat that I showed was a collaboration between a department, Heritage Trade Digital, and some of the team on Living with Machines based at the library, who took all the knowledge that they had about data science using Hugging Face to access machine learning models and whatever, and applied it to a really, really specific library manuscripts foliation issue that we had, which is like a great example of solving a local problem by having access to those skills and that expertise. But I think just to go back to Sam's question, like pilot to operations is really hard. I think talking to people really early and often about what they would expect to see as data outputs is important. But even then, there's a lot of room for things to go just a bit awry. And what collection systems can easily take in mightn't be well aligned with what AI experiments can produce. So you need to have that conversation about, do you use middleware? How do you build into discovery systems? How does it work with what your vendors are doing? But if you can do an alpha or just work through on paper and whiteboards what goes in and what comes out at the end of these experiments or these pilots, to map sort of end to end, that's one of the things that's most likely to help it succeed in coming up with a plan for something that can be operationalized. But it's not easy, and some pilots aren't meant to be taken forward as well. Sometimes you kind of thank them, like Marie Kondo for experiments, thank them for what you've learned and then put them aside.
Yeah, there's a great comment back there from Sam about having product owner and manager skill sets that build those relationships with technology partners, internal partners, so that collaboration can actually work more effectively. I think it's true. I mentioned this once a few years back, that I was looking around to see the emergence of product managers or owners in the university library space. So Sarah, I wonder if you would like to comment on that. Have you seen the growth of that? Because I've certainly seen that. I think that's at University of Sydney. I've seen product owner manager people emerge, but is that a broader trend that you're seeing in university library land?
Definitely, and I think it's the shift from systems librarian to a product owner, so that IT doesn't take that job, right? Because IT is not interested in product ownership. But I think there's also a piece around, business analysts. There's more of those roles coming up as well, to be able to do that initial surveying of what product we need, and not necessarily the actual rollout of the system as well. But I think we're slightly changing job titles just to make sure that IT doesn't take our role.
Well, I do think, maybe I'm biased, but I do think that the emergence perhaps of these roles is because we need that brokerage. We need that translation space to kind of bring the partners together. And it is slightly different in a collaboration around technology development or testing for implementation than the kind of collaboration around literacy levels, which these are very different kind of propositions for collaboration. And it's a really fabulous set of questions there about when it's different and how that collaboration works. There's a great comment here from Kirsty. She said, what concerns me is the digital divide for GLAM organisations which are not able to join this journey. So I'm going to turn that into a question about what sort of models for collaboration do we need to be thinking about when it comes to AI, so that more people can join that journey. And I might say AI for GLAM is one mechanism for this, so that there is at least the ability to look at what is happening elsewhere and glean from others. But Sarah, I wondered if you would like to kind of comment on that, because you've been working in the cultural sector, doing some of that load balancing, because your partners are all at different points in that journey.
Yeah, and I think there's an additional piece of the digital divide where it's digital exclusion, how we've actually started carving off sectors where they're not keeping up in sync with us. So we've sort of left them behind, and they have no way of actually catching up. And I think going with what Mia said originally about legacy planning and making sure that we've got plenty of documentation and we're constantly reviewing our workflows and making sure that the processes are open will help reduce some of that digital divide. But it's the exclusion piece that's scaring me. It's not necessarily in the GLAM sector, but we're finding that especially during COVID, we had to pivot to online very, very quickly. But there's pockets in, regional Australia that don't have access to the internet and don't have access to technology. What happens with them? they suddenly come into the city and they're, you know, hit with this massive technological hurdle that they have to jump through. Is there ways that we can bring them through? And I think skills and being able to use the GLAM sector to help train people will actually help bridge that gap a little bit more.
Yeah, I wonder if you'd like also to comment on that. And then I've got a question from Francesco Franz from ACME stacked up in the chat.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm really aware of like the skills gap. I work for one of 2 biggest libraries in the world, and we don't have resources to match the size of the collections, but I'm so aware of the privilege that we have. Being in a digital research team is like an incredible opportunity. So we really think it's part of our work is to actually share what we've learned as much and as often as we can. But finding ways that it's as easy as possible for small institutions to share any digitized collections, any digitized metadata with bigger projects that are doing those experiments is really important, but also skill sharing and like user groups for particular kinds of vendor software can be a really powerful way of helping people get things back into their systems. And I guess where Europeana are at, they're using to help organizations get their records onto the systems quite as much, but the more that you can do that and like take the bigger organizations or organizations and projects with more resources should take as much as possible of the hard work and the hard thinking. And it's detail work and it's not very sexy, but it's really important if we are serious about our values and being equitable and thinking about digital divides in organizations. So yeah, it's the kind of thing that you have to convince funders is important to make sure it's resourced at the point where the good stuff is happening. But if we don't do that, then we are leaving people behind, and that's something that we have to be honest about. So I think we have a responsibility.
It sounds like in every opportunity to collaborate where there are those large resources is a statement, an outcome statement, which is about propagating value outside of the project and sharing that information. And that is often, I guess, a notable aspect of collaboration where there's meant to be broad spectrum public good generated by that. I will switch tack because this is very pertinent. Thank you, Franz, for the question. Do you think that creating pools of developers working in the GLAM institutions might help to, 1, save money, 2, break barriers, for example, competition, 3, help to share knowledge, so that workloads and financial arrangements need to be worked out? And Sarah, you are sitting right at the centre of that particular challenge there with CAVAL. I'm just wondering if you would like to respond to that question with this idea of models for collaboration around AI.
I think it's not just at CAVAL, but I think the open source community sees that quite frequently with the way that we develop our software. I think if we can create those pools, we need to be able to find a way to communicate and reduce the barriers of those teams working across functions and across organizations. There's actually a book that I go back to quite frequently. It's John O'Bacon's Art of Community and being able to onboard people into an open source project. And I think it's actually quite a helpful piece for the GLAM sector to read as well as to how we can actually bring people along a collaboration piece, and so that we can encourage new people joining and creating a pipeline as well.
Yeah, I think
that's good. Sorry, Mia, I was just going to say that is really good. I'll shut up now.
I was just going to say models like IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Format, and the Universal Viewer, where they're using Open Collective as a model so that institutions can contribute funds that are then distributed well, to a developer who does work sort of on spec that the people who've contributed financially can vote for. I'm sort of mildly troubled by, $1,000, one vote kind of idea, because not everyone can contribute that. But because it's an open source project, we are contributors to Open Collective at the British Library, but we also are building a product team who are working on the Universal Viewer, and shifting from working on an internal repository to working in the open on GitHub with all our issues and user stories from curators and reference services and everyone on GitHub. So they're accessible to everyone, but it means that we're adding overhead in coordinating and managing and communicating, but hopefully it means that our work is more robust and more stable, and that other institutions, we're coming up with solutions that are better because we're doing them with other institutions. And I think there's a lot of value in communities of practice. Like, probably centralizing in some way is sensible, but it's working out the funding models that would work in the Australian context or in the state context or in the New Zealand context could be tricky. But even the easiest thing you can do is have a community of practice and give your developers and your product owners and your UX people time to take part in those conversations, maybe some travel money to go and meet with others. Because I think it's easier to collaborate if you've met, if you spent time together, if you understand where each other's coming from. So you're kind of investing in relationships as well as in technology. And that can be a way of just making it easier for someone to say, I've got this weird Python error or whatever you need help with. You're not just sitting there alone staring at a keyboard in frustration, but you've got lots of people that you can ask, or people can help you optimize your plans. I think people, I mean, I'm a fan of collaboration, so I think we often go further together, but it can be about making sure that people who are relatively lower down in the organization also have the agency to go and collaborate with others, and you're encouraging that rather than expecting them to fit it in around other things.
I think there's a very interesting point there about the overhead. I think that's one of the myths, is that actually there is extra overhead to kind of try and extract a bit more value and to go a bit further. But it's actually, you've just talked about it paying off in really significant ways. And I hesitate to ask this question of both of you, because I think it's going to come back to your point about it depends. And it's in your experience, has the collaboration that you've undertaken been scalable? And you both have kind of touched on the very different kinds of collaboration, but I think this is about how much you can bite off and chew. And there's an element of this because it's moving very fast and it's a really big change. So are there ideas that you've got there about setting up collaborations that help you with that sort of load balancing, understanding just how much you can achieve?
I think from an open perspective, scale is really, really hard to manage from a community perspective because there's so many people that could potentially contribute to a project. But if we can actually break it down into bite-sized chunks or activity-based outcomes, then it becomes a bit more manageable. But then you need to find the community managers to be able to manage that collaboration piece. And I think that it could work to the strengths of, the GLAM sector quite well, where we make sure that there's a structure involved and making sure that, each team has a community manager, a facilitator, project manager, just to make sure that things move along. But it does require very specific governance. And I think going back to Mia's point about, dollar for dollar vote matching, it doesn't necessarily help with the context in the likes of Australia and New Zealand because we're such a small part of the world. Our votes are a lot less than in the US or, where the population is a lot bigger. So I think if there's ways that we can actually contribute to provide context and provide development activities from our region, that will help projects scale better in a more equitable and accessible way.
Yeah, this is interesting. So one of the offers we made as a regional chapter for the AI for LAM was to actually provide support for video editing, which sounds very small, but it's a small contribution that we can make to the broader community, because in the broader community there's an enormous amount going on. So I guess that is the complexity when you look at the whole community trying to sort of grapple with these technologies and look at how to leverage them. I'm conscious we've got 11 minutes on the clock, and I'm just wondering if anyone else on the call has some questions they'd like to put into the chat for Mia and Sarah. We've got plenty stacked up here, but there may be something that you'd just like to ask, a burning question that you've got. So I might pause there, and while you're having a bit of a think, I'm going to put some links in the chat.
I was just going to say on that last one, I think identifying the pain points that
oh yes,
that's really important, because you might be able to really simply say, you know, administrative support for doing all those meeting polls or doing the editing or finding a venue. Like collaboration and funded infrastructure doesn't have to only be about like Azure or machine learning models or whatever. It can also be about like a space to meet, a regular, having someone who sends out meeting seminar updates and invites and documents things afterwards and does that kind of like some of the work that we'd all like to do more of, but it actually takes quite a lot of time. So yeah, being creative about understanding what are the barriers to collaboration. It might be mapping metadata is hard, so can you find resources to do that? Or yeah, understanding what's needed in the local context.
Sarah, I'm wondering if you've got something to add to that.
No, it's more just echoing, is understanding the problem and being able to find and tap into the right skill sets, because I think we don't quite necessarily understand all the skills that everyone has, and maybe you know, if people find an easy way to start contributing, they'll be able to broaden their scope a bit more and help tackle some of those issues. Yeah,
because there are some very kind of high profile contributions to make when you collaborate, and some of that is about the development of new technologies, and we're certainly doing that here at the National Film and Sound Archive. But given that we've got a bit of still a bit of time left on the clock, there is that kind of, is there something that has kind of given you that moment of, gee, this was worth it? Because collaboration can be coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. You know, there are depths to that. And you've touched on that, I think, Sarah, about needing to meet people, and so have you, Mia. And I'm just wondering, are there moments where you've said, and I think you've already mentioned, Mia, about what you get the benefit of by going into a partnership. So I guess some incentives and maybe a cautionary note, why you would say, yes, do this, but don't forget.
Yeah, I think one of the things about living with machines was that there was room for things to bubble up from conversations and from teams. So there was room to say, hey, this could be worth exploring. And some of the work using Ordnance Survey maps and developing computer vision methods and annotation methods to scale up, to train machine learning models to find features on maps came from those kinds of conversations. So in some ways, that's a capacity thing. Like if you've got time to think and experiment, that has benefits regardless of if it's a huge collaboration or a small pilot. And I think the challenge is always like understanding the compromises and not being too purist about it. So sometimes sending information to an infrastructure, you learn something. It might not be like the perfect system that you would dream of, but if you're going to learn something, then maybe that makes it worth it.
Yes, I wrote compromise down in my notes because there is always compromise in collaboration. Great point. Sarah, what about you?
I think just to add to that, don't let perfection get in the way of progress, because I think we find ourselves stuck in the weeds, you know, especially in the metadata space. You know, the full stop's not in the right place. Is it going to break our systems? Probably not. And just trying to find a happy medium of, is there a way that we can bring others into the industry that's not necessarily from the library sector? Can we talk with IT and bring them in? And I think Ingrid and I have many conversations about, you know, trying to bring in the other sectors to work with us and work in our sector so that there's exposure to different ways of working and not just in our siloed sort of sector.
Yes, I definitely see a theme here about those kind of boundary spaces. People who can broker those in very practical ways, whether they're product owners and managers or business analysts, that kind of thing, but also the conversations that work across those boundaries. I can see, well, the experiences that you've both had really do tell us that we've kind of got big challenges. They move around pretty quickly, but I also think it's a really golden opportunity to, and I think you mentioned this, Mia, about to be more multidisciplinary in the approach that we take, to perhaps extend a little past. I mean, it took a while for the GLAMs to become the GLAMs, and maybe this is another opportunity for us to be a bit more than GLAMs, actually, that we're hybridizing in the ways that we're working by having those relationships with people who are data scientists, who are computer scientists, who are researchers. I think there's a really rich scene here for us to work with. Well, we've got 4 minutes on the clock. I'm going to pop a couple of links in the chat for those who want to sign up to the AI for LAM group, and also to come to the Fantastic Futures conference. But I just would really like to thank Sarah and Mia for getting into conversation today, because I think collaboration is really going to help us try and leverage what we can out of these new technologies, but also kind of, I guess, keep the guardrails on, but also maybe to discover what it's like working a little bit more outside of our boundaries, and to understand a whole lot more about how collaboration powers the work that we do, because it does, absolutely. I think you wrote, Mia, that it was in our DNA. And so maybe it's just that we just need to work that muscle a bit more at the moment to, well, conquer and bring these technologies and translate what they can do for our collecting organisations through these different kinds of partnerships, for sure. Would you like to round off with any comment before we close for the day? A call to action?
I think, yeah, it's just about like having conversations and collaborating and entering into things with a spirit of generosity and sort of embracing the joy of learning through this. Like, I think collaborating for me is, I think, better with people, and I learn so much from collaborating with others. So it's hugely positive, even when it's hard.
Yes, I think that's a really great, it does, it kind of exercises you in a different way. And what about you, Sarah? You've been thick and fast in the open source community. You know how this works.
I think for me, it's have fun and remove the barriers as much as possible and let people in. I think the one rule that I learned at a conference was the Pac-Man rule, is always leave your circle with a gap for someone to be able to jump in, and do that with your online spaces and your community spaces as well, because someone will be able to contribute, you know, just a little bit of a different idea, and that makes the whole experience more rich.
So I hope that means that people will open the windows and doors and say, we'd like to collaborate. There's anyone game. Thanks everyone for joining us today. That was a really wonderful conversation to start this series off with. We're open to taking suggestions for the next set of talks, and we hope you'll join us again fairly soon. And for those of you who are able to come to the Fantastic Futures Conference in October, we'll be in touch with you soon. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting, and Mia for spending time with us while you were here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.